Have you ever wanted to learn the Unity game engine to make beautiful 3D environments, levels, and games? In this short course, you will learn all the necessary skills and tools needed to do so. You'll start by going over the Unity interface and will proceed with creating a 3D environment by creating terrains, trees, mountains, and valleys. All of these skills will allow you to create an environment of your dreams. On top of the design aspects, you'll learn other important tools such as prefabs and components, which are key elements depending on what you want to create. At the end of the course, you will also be given a quick overview of Unity's asset store, a fantastic marketplace for getting all sorts of assets needed to create the scene of your dreams. Don't wait and start learning the basics of level design now by taking this course. Welcome everybody. In this lecture we're going to be discussing the Unity interface. Now the Unity interface might look a bit daunting at first. It most definitely did for me when I was starting with this software, but by the end of this lecture everything should be a lot more clear. So let's start up here where it says hierarchy. The hierarchy is very good for organizing things that are in your scene and also for renaming objects and just in general seeing what is in your scene. So by default you should have a main camera in your scene and a directional light in your scene. And we're not going to discuss those right now, but just know that they're in your scene by default. Now what we could do here in Unity is we could go to Game Object, 3D Object, and then Cube. And as you can see, we can add all sorts of objects here. We could add spheres and capsules. Really, Unity just comes with some basic objects you can add into your scene. So as you can see, I have a cube here, a sphere, and a capsule that I just added into the scene. They're in our scene and they're also appearing in our hierarchy. What you can also do in the hierarchy is rename your objects. So for example, if I want to rename this capsule, I'll just click on it once and then I'll rename it to something. You can also rename objects by going over here to the inspector and just renaming the object right there as well. Either way works. Another useful thing that you will be doing a lot is organizing things that are in your scene. For example, if I add a cube, or actually I already have a cube, so I'm just going to go ahead and add a plane. And let's say I wanted to add a bunch of planes, so I just keep duplicating these and duplicating these. As you can see, it's going to get a bit messy. There's going to be a lot of planes appearing here in your hierarchy. So a cool thing here in the hierarchy that you can do is you can right click, you can click Create Empty, and then what you can do is rename this to something general to add all of your objects in for organizational purposes. As you can see, an arrow appeared here, and that's because the empty automatically went inside this plane here as a child. That's because this was highlighted when I selected it. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag this out, and I'm going to rename this game object to planes. And now what you can do is you can select all your planes. If you shift select, it'll select everything through the final object you selected, or you can control select, which will select everything individually. And then you can drag all your objects into this empty, and as you can see, we can use this to organize things so that we don't have a bunch of objects appearing in our hierarchy. That's about it for the hierarchy. As you can see, it's very good for organizing objects and seeing what is in your scene. So now let's go over here to where it says assets. Now you probably won't have anything in here unless you imported stuff prior to beginning this course. What you can do is you can right click and import some new things. So if you go to import package, you'll see a bunch of things here: particle systems, environment, effects. These are things that come with Unity. If, for example, you're a 3D artist and you create your own models, you could also import your assets manually. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and import something that comes with Unity by default. So I'm just going to go to Import Package, and then go to Environment. And as you can see here, a bunch of stuff pops up. If you really wanted to, you could select what you wanted to be imported, but I'm just going to go ahead and import everything. And it might take a while, so just wait for it to import. Alright, so we just imported the environment assets, and you'll have two folders. If you go in here to this standard assets folder, you'll have an environment folder, a utility folder, and another cross-platform folder. You don't really need to mess with that. So I'm just going to go here into the environment folder, and as you'll be able to see, you have a bunch of different environment things. You have some water, prefabs, you have, and we'll go over prefabs later in the course. You'll have trees, just a bunch of different things that come pre-installed with Unity. But don't worry about all this stuff for now. We'll eventually go over this stuff in a bit more detail later in the course. But this assets folder is really good for organization as well. What you can do is you can create a folder and say here you wanted to add trees. You could name your folder trees and then say you had a bunch of different tree models. You could add all of your tree models inside of this tree folder. So I'm going to show you what I mean. I'm just going to go ahead and import some low poly trees that I created so that you can see what I'm talking about. So here are some tree assets that I created for another one of my courses, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag some of these trees into the scene. And as expected, they will appear here in the hierarchy so that we can organize them and also rename them. But here in this assets folder, say we had 100 different trees. Well, we don't want 100 different trees flooding this entire assets area. We want to be able to just drag all those models into a different folder. And that's the difference with the hierarchy here. This is just for organizing names and what's in your scene. This is actually to organize and manipulate the physical objects that go in our scene, for lack of better explanation. And everything will make more sense as we progress into this course, of course. So I'm just going to drag these trees into this trees folder. And as you can see, they are all neatly organized inside this trees folder. And up here, I'm just going to go ahead and create an empty, name it trees, and then I'm just going to drag all of these tree names here into this empty. So we can organize stuff in the hierarchy, but you should also be able to see how we can organize stuff in this assets area with actual objects that are in our scene. So the next thing we need to discuss is the inspector. And don't worry if you're not too familiar with this assets area yet. It's really hard to explain in just a few minutes, but as we progress into this course, we'll be using this area a lot and it will make a lot more sense. So let's discuss the inspector. Here I'm going to click on one of the trees here in the hierarchy, and as you'll be able to see, we have a bunch of different things that appear here. We have a mesh renderer, we have some shaders here, and this is all stuff we're going to go over in separate lectures, but just realize that the inspector covers things like mesh renderers, colors, and a whole bunch of different components. You could add scripts to your objects, you could add physics to your objects. There's just a bunch of stuff here that we really don't want to go over in the interface lectures. So we'll go over all this stuff in separate lectures. But really that's what the inspector is for all the specifics of an individual model and what you want to do to that model. So let's go ahead and discuss some of these other options up here: game, asset store, and animator. This game tab here is where we can actually play our game. Now if you go and click play, nothing's going to happen, and say you're in the scene, if you click play, it's automatically going to go to this game tab and nothing is happening, and eventually something will happen as we go further into this course, but just realize that this game tab is for the actual game. So once you click play, you could actually play your game once it's built and created, of course. This tab here is for the asset store. We don't really need to go in there. This is just where you can buy and download a whole bunch of different assets, and it's just a big community market. Here is the animator, and this is a bit more complex. You'd have to get a bit more deeper into the subject. But really what you can do is you can show how you want an object to animate. So you'll have a bunch of different nodes you'll connect and stuff like that to determine how you want the animation to work, but that is a bit more complicated and it's probably not going to be covered in a beginner course here. but this really just covers animation, and there's a ton of videos out there if you really wanted to learn about how this works. Up here we have some movement tools here. So what you can do with this hand is you can manually drag your objects, or rather drag the scene around so you can see what's in your scene. And if you right click and hold and look around, you can look around your scene. This here is what moves your objects. So I'm just going to look down a little bit, and you can see that an origin appears here. And what you can do is you can just move this origin around, and it really just moves around your object. This here is for rotation. This here is for scaling. And this here is a bit strange. You can just manually move and scale how you want this object to look. It's a bit strange, but you can mess around with it and see what all this stuff does. Sometimes just doing things in the software is really how you learn everything. So this is about it for the basics of the interface, and hopefully you understand this interface a lot more and it's a lot less daunting. And as we progress throughout this course, this interface will all come together and make more sense. So I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome back, everybody. In this lecture we're going to be discussing terrains. Now, terrains are really important in Unity because that is how you can create your environment. That's where you can place your assets and all sorts of other things, which we'll be going over. So to add a terrain, you want to go up here to where it says Game Object. You're going to click 3D Object, and then you're going to click Terrain. Now, you should have a really big plane that appears in your scene, and you can fly above it so that you can actually see the entire thing by holding right click and just using the WASD keys like you would when you're playing a game. And if you hold shift, you'll fly out a bit faster. Now, I don't really need a big terrain, so what I'm going to do here is go into the settings menu. It's this little cog icon, and then I'm going to go to where it says terrain width and terrain length, and I'm just going to decrease that to something like 400. Obviously it doesn't make that much of a difference, but sometimes right off the bat you'll just want to decrease your terrain size, and in some cases you might even want to make it a bit bigger. So I'm just going to stick with 400 by 400 for now, and that's how you do change the size if you want to do that at first. So we'll go over these settings later on, but let's start at the beginning here. This option here allows you to raise and lower your terrain. Now you'll see that there are a bunch of different brushes here. You have a brush size and you have an opacity. So let's go ahead and discuss what all of these things do. So this first one here is just a little circle, and then the second one's a bit bigger, third one's a bit bigger, and then the fourth one is the biggest circle you have here. Now what you can do is you can just hover over your terrain and you can start painting all sorts of things. You can paint, I guess this is kind of a mountain right here, and if you use a bigger circle you'll get even taller mountains, and of course it will also take on the shape of the brush you use. Now I'm just going to fly above this so you can see this a bit better. And you can mess with all of these brushes here. You have an interesting star shape, and you get some strange terrain mountain type things here. You have some dots you can play around with, and there's all sorts of things you can do. I'm not going to go over all of these here because it's really easy for you to try out on your own, but what I will go over is the brush size and the opacity. Now brush size, obviously you can change how big you want the brush size to be. If you want it to be small, you'll have some smaller mountains, and if you want it to be big, you can have some bigger mountains. Now, if you want to remove some of these mountains you painted here, you can hold shift and just paint back over them like you were doing before. Now, there is a quicker way to do that if you just want to completely flatten everything here on the terrain. You can go here to where it says paint height, it's the second icon here, and you can just click flatten. Now, what happened here was it was at 15 and it went up 15 meters, so I'm just going to change this back to 0 and put it right back on the grid here. But anyways, we'll go over that later on. So brush size, obviously you can choose how big you want your mountains to be, And what opacity does is it determines how quickly the mountains begin to be painted. So if you turn this down really low, it will slowly paint your mountains, and you'll just have to keep painting back and forth across them for them to get bigger. You can increase the opacity some more, and you'll be able to see that they grow a bit quicker. And if you put it all the way to 100, they'll grow almost immediately. So that's what opacity does. Now the second tool here is the paint height tool, and what this tool allows you to do is it allows you to limit the height that you want your painted mountains to be. So if I set this to say, let's say 46 is fine, and I just start painting, you'll see that it flattens out on the top, and that's because we have a limit of 46 units. It's not going above this 46 mark on the Unity scene here. So you won't be able to go above this 46, well in my case 46, because that's what it's set to, unless I increase this. So if I increase this to something like 71 here, looks like that's what I got, and I start painting, it'll cap out at 71 units. And now what I can do with this other mountain if I wanted to is I could paint back over that, but it's just going to limit how high these mountains are painted. So right now it's limited to 71. No matter what brush I use, it's going to cap out at 71 units, and it's just going to flatten out the top. Now let's say I tone this down a little bit. Let's say I put this to something like 36, and I start painting again. Well, of course, it's going to cap out at that 36 mark. But if you try to paint over anything that's above that mark, it'll start decreasing, as you can see there. It's going to decrease until it hits that 36 unit mark. So this tool is really useful if you want to limit how high you want your mountains to be. And this flatten tool here, we already briefly went over that, but what it allows you to do is it allows you to just completely flatten your terrain of all the mountains. So if I click flatten right now, it's going to flatten the terrain, and the terrain is going to move to the 36 unit mark. If I put this to 0 and click flatten, it's going to flatten back out at the 0 unit mark, so it's just right on the grid. Now, I personally never flatten my terrain out at 0 because that means I won't be able to dig under the terrain at all. So if in my game I wanted to put a valley or a lake or something, I won't be able to dig into my terrain. If I go here to where it says raise and lower terrain and hold shift and click, it's not going to do anything. All I can do is paint stuff. So what you really want to do is you want to flatten out the height at something over 0. So I'm just going to go ahead and put something like 30 and click flatten. And now what you can do is you can dig into your terrain by holding shift and clicking around. Just make sure you're in this first tab here. And you can just dig into your terrain all you want. So I would recommend keeping this flattened at something above 0 so that you can do this type of thing, but it's really all up to you. So that's really all the paint height tool does. Hopefully you see how it's useful. And let's go ahead and discuss the smooth height tool. Now I went ahead and added some really spiky mountains to my terrain and in the ground and whatnot. Now before we go over the smooth height tool, what I would like you to do is to pause the video and add a bunch of different mountains here using all these different brushes and just start painting random mountains all over your terrain. Make some different brush sizes, some different brushes here, and just start painting random mountains all over your terrain. And then once you've done that, we're going to go over what the smooth height tool does. So just go ahead and pause and do that to your terrain so it looks kind of crazy like this. Alright, so hopefully you've went ahead and added some crazy mountains to your terrain. So now we can discuss what the smooth height tool does. Now I'm just going to increase this brush size a little bit and the opacity a little bit. And what the smooth height tool allows you to do is it allows you to smooth out your mountains in your terrain. So as you can see right here, I have a really spiky area. And if I just paint over this using the smooth height tool, it will actually smooth out those mountains and smooth out your terrain. So wherever I paint over, it's just smoothing everything out. And it's really useful because sometimes things will look really sharp like this, and you'll just really want to make it look a lot more smoother like that. And of course the opacity works the same way. It'll be quicker the higher it is, It'll be slower the lower it is. So really just mess around with the brush size and the opacity and see what works for you. But really the smooth height tool just allows you to smooth out your terrain wherever you paint. And it can be really useful, especially when it comes to all these crazy mountains that you might have in your scene. So go ahead and mess around with the smooth height tool, smooth out some of the mountains you added in your terrain, and see how it looks. Now the next thing we're going to discuss here is the paint texture tool. Now this is a really useful tool because you can paint textures directly onto your terrain here. So what I've done is I've just added some basic colors here into the Unity project, and all I did to do that was I opened Microsoft Paint and then I literally used the paint bucket tool to add a color and then saved these colors into my scene. So if you go here to where it says edit textures and add texture, what you can do is you can go here where it says none texture 2D, and you can add whatever texture you want. So I'm not going to add any of these because I don't need to right now. I'm just going to go ahead and find some of the colors I added. Here's a tan one, and then I'm going to click add, and then I'm going to click add to add another one, and you can actually even drag in your textures if you'd like. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and drag in all of these textures here. Alright, so I went ahead and added some colors here, and what you can do is you can paint these colors right onto your terrain, and it doesn't have to be colors, it can be any texture literally. Now by default it made this terrain tan because that's the first one I added. If for some reason I didn't want it to be that color, I could just click edit texture and I'll just go ahead and, for example, drag in that white one, and then I can just choose whatever color I want the terrain to be, but I'm just going to leave it tan where it was. And then what you can do is you can select any of these other textures and just start painting that color. And you can use the brush size and opacity the same way. And what target strength does is it determines how hard of a color you want it to appear. So for example, if you want this green color to fully appear green when you paint it onto the terrain, keep the target strength at 1. If you don't want it to be fully green and kind of a faint color, you can decrease that target strength, and it will only be green to a certain extent, as you can see there. And that's the same for any of your textures that you add into the scene. Now Unity actually comes with some default textures as well, a bit more realistic textures rather than some basic colors. So if you want to add those in, you just go to add texture, select, and then you can just go down here until you find it. And right here, here's a grass texture, and I'm just going to add that. And I can actually paint this grass onto the scene, and that looks a lot more realistic, obviously. Now you might not have this texture if you didn't import the environment package here, but if you followed what I did in the last lecture, then you probably already have this in your scene. So you can add any texture you want over here and paint it directly onto your terrain. And it's really useful, especially if you don't want a boring white terrain. You want to actually add some textures to it. So that's all for the paint texture tool. So now let's go ahead and discuss the trees. So I just went ahead and quickly flattened the terrain and added some grass texture to it. So let's go ahead and discuss the place trees option here. If you go to edit trees and click add tree, you can add some tree prefabs here. So I'm just going to click on this little dot, and I'm going to add these trees that appear here. Now these trees came with the Unity environment package that I installed in the previous lecture, so you might want to install that if you want to mess around with these default trees. So I'm going to add all 3 of these. There's the first one, there's the second one, and there's the third one. So what you can do, just like you did with this paint tool, is you can paint trees on to your terrain. Now of course you know what the brush size does by now. What tree density does is it determines how many trees are going to place in one particular area. So if you want the trees to be spread out and not too clamped together, I would decrease this really low. If you want a bunch of trees to appear within the same area, you can increase that, and as you'll be able to see when I click, a bunch of trees will appear all in the same area. Now I personally like to keep mine really low because I don't like that many trees in my scenes, but that's really all up to you and personal preference. What this tree height tool allows you to do is it allows you to randomize how high you want your trees to be. Now if you deselect that box, you can actually manually put in how high you want your trees to be. So if you put that really low, then your trees are going to be really tiny, and if you put this all the way up, then obviously they're going to be quite large. Now I'm just going to keep mine on random, so it'll just randomize it for me. I'm just going to delete some of these out, and if you want to delete your trees, just hold shift and paint back over them. So I'm just going to keep the tree height on random. What the lock width to height does is it keeps your trees kind of uniform. If you deselect this and say you make the tree width really low here, you'll have really skinny trees if you have this really low and the height really high. And vice versa, if you have the tree width really high and the height really low, then you're going to have pretty much some flat trees. So I would recommend just keeping the width locked to the height, so that'll kind of do that job for you. Now it does look like the height is still low, so I'm just going to drag that back up. And of course your trees will also grow because the height is a lot higher. Random tree rotation just randomizes how the trees are rotated. I would recommend just keeping that on to give a bit of variety. And that's really all there is to it with this Place Trees tab. The final thing I'll quickly discuss is that you can mass place trees all at once, and you can determine how many trees you want in your scene. I don't want 10,000 trees, I'm going to put like 100. That's probably enough. And if you click place, then 100 trees will be randomly placed in your scene, and there will be trees of all the types that are currently in this folder here. So that's the placing trees option. You can place trees and edit all the options for your trees. So hopefully you mess around with that and see how it works. What this Paint Details tab allows you to do is it allows you to paint detail meshes and grass textures. So you can go ahead and click on Add Grass Texture, and then go up here to where it says Detailed Texture, and just scroll down a little bit, assuming you have your environment assets placed in your scene, which you probably do by now. And you should be able to see some grass around here. And you can also just search grass and it will pop up. So there's two different types of grass that come with Unity, so I'm just going to add both of those in. So there's the first one, and the second one. Now before I click add, I'm just going to go over some of these. You can just change the minimum width, the maximum width, and the minimum height and the maximum height of your grass. You can mess around with that a little bit. And billboarding, basically what billboarding does is it makes your grass face the same direction no matter where you are in the scene. So we'll go over that so you can kind of see what that looks like. Now what you can do, just like with the trees and basically everything else involving painting, you can just paint the grass right into your scene. And you can decrease the brush size, of course, and the opacity and the target strength, and you can get a lot less grass if you'd like. I'm just going to delete some of these and just put a little bit less. Now you'll be able to see when you paint really far away, you might not be able to see the grass. And that's just a performance setting in Unity. If you go over here and increase the detail distance, you'll be able to see the grass in the distance, but of course that will take more processing power. So let's go ahead and quickly discuss what that billboarding option does. So I'm going to go and edit this tree right here, and I'm going to click billboard, or deselect billboard. So what you'll be able to see is that this grass, wherever you move around, it's not facing necessarily the same direction. But when you enable billboarding, it's always going to end up facing you. So as you can see, no matter where I turn, the grass is kind of turning with me. So just kind of mess around with that, and so you can see what the difference is. It should be fairly clear once you look at it pretty closely. And of course you can use the brush tools and paint different types of shapes of grass, so you can mess around with that. And what this tab here does is it allows you to add detail mesh, so you can add rocks and other things that aren't grass. So you can mess around with that as well, it's nothing too complicated. But that's about it for the Paint Details tab. So now let's go over some of the terrain settings. Now instead of going over each of these settings individually, I'm going to go ahead and post the documentation and the resources for this section. So that way you can quickly read over what each of these settings do, and I'll be able to save some time for the course. Now I will, however, tell you which ones you're going to use quite often. You'll definitely be using detail density a lot, tree distance, billboard start, and fade length. I use all of these all the time in my scenes. You'll also be using the terrain options here where it says resolution. You'll probably be changing these quite often, especially the height, the length, and the width of the terrain. When settings for grass, sometimes you'll want to mess with these. You can change the speed and size and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll mess with these settings. These are the ones I use the least often. And that's really about it for the terrain settings. Now, as I said, I'm going to post the documentation so you can read over what each of these do. I'd recommend quickly going over it. It's only a few sentences for each of these, so you can kind of have an idea of what all of them do. So I will see you in the next section. Welcome everybody. In this video I'm going to be discussing prefabs. Now prefabs are very, very important in Unity because it allows you to reuse objects with the same properties you gave to them. So that way you won't have to manually add certain properties to every single object in the scene. So that might sound a bit confusing, so I'll just go ahead and demonstrate. I'm going to go up here to Game Object and add, I guess I'll add a cube. Cubes are the easiest to work with. So obviously when you add a cube into your scene, a cube is going to appear. So let's say I didn't really want this to be a cube anymore. I wanted it to be a bit more stretched out. So I'm just going to go ahead and stretch this out a little bit. Okay, perfect. So if I want to ever add more of these into the scene, I can either duplicate it by pressing Ctrl D, or I can just drag one of these into the Assets folder and then just manually drag them in whenever I want. So as you can see, I'll drag these in and they all have the same properties that I just changed. Now let's say I wanted to change the cube back to a cube shape. So I'm going to scale this down so it looks more like a cube. And I think that's close enough. So okay, we just changed this back to a cube, so I'm just going to go ahead and drag this into the scene and it should be a cube, right? Well no, that's because we haven't actually added this back into our assets folder so that we can reuse it with the same properties we just changed. So if you want it to retain these properties, all you have to do is drag in that object into your assets folder. So now whenever you drag it into the scene, it's going to retain those properties. And this here is what a prefab is. It just allows you to retain the properties that you made to an object. So that way you won't have to drag this in and then change it to a cube every single time, because that would just take way too much time. So I'm going to go ahead and also make a demonstration with some components that might make a bit more sense. Alright, I'm going to do a different demonstration here. So I'm going to add another cube back into the scene. So we have our cube here, no issue. Now let's say I wanted to add some components to this cube. Now don't worry, we will go over components later on, so just kind of follow along with me for now. Let's say I wanted to add an audio source, and what an audio source allows you to do is have some audio come from an object itself. So whenever you get near the object, you should be able to hear audio, assuming you put audio onto it. But we'll go over the components later on. And let's say I also wanted to add a script, for example. Now I need to go to New Script, and I'll just create and add a script. So obviously with scripts you can program all sorts of functionality to your Unity objects, but that's for a different course. This course is just covering how to use Unity, not how to program. So let's say I added an audio source and a new script to this object. Okay, cool. Now let's say I wanted to have this object retain all these properties for every single instance I put into the scene. So that's what prefabs are really for. You just take this object that you edited with the components, drag it into your assets folder, and then every time you add a new one of those, it's retaining the same properties as the original one. So that's really all a prefab is it just allows you to reuse properties that you added to an object without having to manually add those properties for every single object you put into the scene. So that's really the beauty of prefabs, is that you can save a lot of time, and hopefully you see that. So that's really all a prefab is. Hopefully you understand. If you do have any questions on how it works, don't hesitate to post in the discussions, and I'll see you in the next video. Welcome back, everybody. In this video we'll quickly be discussing components. Now whenever you add something new to your scene, any object, you should have a tab here called Add Components. Now I'm using a cube here as an example, and when you go to Add Component, you can add all sorts of components to your object. You could add scripts, UI, physics, you'll be using physics a lot. Audio, you'll be using audio depending on if you need audio for your object, and all sorts of other stuff. But this is all stuff that you really have to go and check out for yourself. I will definitely be discussing the important ones in the next lecture. We'll be discussing a little bit about physics and audio and scripts, but the other ones are just not as important, I would say. It really all depends on what you're doing. But at the end of the day, all components allow you to do is add all sorts of functionality to your objects, and you'll be using components a lot in Unity. So in the next video we'll be going over some components specifically, so let's go ahead and do that. Welcome back, everybody. In this video we're going to be going a bit more detail into components. Now to start off, we're going to discuss colliders, and colliders are very important here in Unity. You'll be using them a lot. So if you go to Game Object, 3D Object, and add a cube, for example, I always like to use cubes as an example, you should obviously have a cube here in your scene. Now you will also notice there is a box collider that comes with the cube. So let's discuss what this box collider does here. I'm going to go ahead and add a component and add a rigid body. What a rigid body allows you to do is add physics to your object and allow gravity to pull down your object and interact with the environment. A rigid body is basically what gives your objects life, if you think about it like that. So I'm going to go ahead and click play here, and you will see that the cube falls to the ground. If I turn off, or rather disable this rigid body, I'll just remove the component, you'll see that the cube just floats there. So you're always, well not always, but a lot of times you're going to want to have a rigid body with your objects. So if you click play with the rigid body, obviously your cube's going to fall. And that is because we have a box collider here. It stops once it hits the ground. And if we disable this box collider, it's just going to fall straight through the ground. And that's all a collider does. It allows you to interact with the environment. It detects other pieces in your environment. And in this case, it's detecting the terrain on the bottom, and it's not allowing the box to just fall through the ground. Unless, of course, your box collider is disabled. So that's basically what a collider allows you to do as a general overview. You should also see something here called isTrigger. If you enable that, it won't really interact with the environment at all. It'll just fall straight through things, just as you saw when you disabled the box collider. And you can change all sorts of settings here. You can change the center, so if I increase this, the collider will actually move away from the box. You probably won't really need to do that. There's not really a reason to, but it all depends on what you're working with. So you can mess around with some of the collider settings and see what those do. Another cool feature of colliders is that the collider doesn't have to be where your box is. So you can increase this Z, for example, or actually we're probably going to need to increase the Y because I'm working with Unity. I'm so used to Blender. So if I drag this down, you'll see that the collider goes below the cube. And what happens when you click play? Well, the collider hits the ground and the cube's kind of floating there. And that's because Unity is basing where the cube stops based off of where this collider is. So the moment this collider hits the ground, the cube's gonna stop. The collider is really what is controlling this cube here, not the cube itself. Another component I'd like to discuss is the mesh renderer. Now, if you ever need to add a mesh renderer, just go to Add Component, Mesh, and then the mesh renderer is right there. Basically, a mesh renderer is what renders your object. So here's the cube. If I untick the mesh renderer, you don't see the cube anymore. You just see the outline of the box collider. So a mesh renderer is pretty important because you want to be able to see your objects, of course. If you want to cast shadows, you can keep that on. If you don't, you can turn that off. If you want your objects to receive shadows, you can keep that on. And there's other things such as light probes and reflection probes, which if you want to research into those, you can, but this is supposed to be an introductory short course, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about those. That's really all a mesh renderer does. Just make sure you have one, and if you don't, then that's probably why you can't see your object. But by default, all your objects should have a mesh renderer on it. So that's all a mesh renderer does. Another important component is the audio source component. And to add an audio source component, simply go to Add Component, Audio, and then Audio Source. And you'll have a bunch of settings here, of course. The audio clip is the audio clip that you would like to add so that the sound can come from your object. So, for example, if you wanted a piece of music to come from your cube here, you would just add that music here into the audio clip section. And of course you would need some sort of audio here in your Unity project in order to add that. The output basically allows you to output sound, but you would need an audio listener for that. Mute allows you to simply mute your audio. Bypass effects and listener effects and reverb zones are a bit more advanced. I'll link the documentation if you would like to read up on that. Play on Awake allows you to play the music or whatever sounds coming through your audio source the moment you click play on your game. Loop allows you to loop through your music, so the moment that audio ends, it will play through again. You can change some priority settings, volume, pitch, stereo pan. I wouldn't recommend keeping that in the middle unless for some reason you wanted audio to be more in the right ear or left ear. Spatial blend, if you have a 3D object with your audio source, you might just want to keep that on 3D so that you have 3D audio. If you have 2D audio, it's going to play all throughout the scene. And there are some other settings here. You can change graph setting. This is a bit more advanced as well. But of course, I'll link the documentation so you can read up on anything you're more interested in. That's really all an audio source is for. It's just to output audio, and you'll probably be using those quite often, especially if you want audio in your games. So that's about it on the subject of components. You can go ahead and look through all these other components because I'm not saying they're not important. I just really wanted to focus on some components that you could use to mess around with Unity if you just wanted to get started on a scene after taking this course. And these components are going to be very important to know. So in the next video we'll be discussing the character controller so that you can actually make your game come to life. So let's get started with that. Welcome back everyone. In this video we're going to be discussing the character controller. And the character controller is what allows you to walk around in your scene and have a first-person perspective when playing your game. Now there is a default one that comes with Unity, and you can just go ahead and install that right from Unity here. So to do that, you're going to want to right click, go to Import Package, and then go down to Characters. And then just let it import everything. You can leave everything as it is and just import everything. Now once everything is imported, you're going to have a folder here called Standard Assets. If you click on that and then go to Characters, go to First Person, and then go to Prefabs, you'll see two things here. Now you can just go ahead and use this FPS controller here. It has everything you're going to need. Just drag that into the scene and make sure your character is above the ground so that way you don't fall through. So just drag him up a little bit. And when you click play, you'll be able to walk around your scene. And it does look like this bottom part's a little bit glitched. Let me just fix that. And you can now walk around your scene no problem, so it actually feels like a game when you do that. Now that's all there is for the character controller. I'm going to go ahead and discuss some options here that you can change if you want to, because they might be useful. So let's go ahead and get into that. Now I assume that you can intuitively understand what all these things do, such as walk speed, run speed, and other stuff like that. But what I really want you to do is just go ahead and mess with some of these options here, because there are really a ton, and me droning on about each of them is probably not going to do much, because all you really need to do is mess with these settings and see what they do. Obviously walk speed is going to increase your walk speed, run speed is going to increase your run speed, and if you want to run you just hold shift. And there's a bunch of settings here, so just go ahead and mess with some of these here and just kind of see what they all do. And I'll also post the documentation as a resource for this lecture. Welcome back everybody. In this video I'm going to show you how to import custom assets into Unity. Now if you're a 3D artist or create any sort of artwork that you would like to use in your Unity scene, you can most definitely do that. So if you want to import any of your work, you're just going to right click in Unity and click on import new asset and then navigate to wherever that asset is. And I'll kind of give a practical example here as well. I use Blender a lot and create a lot of 3D models in Blender for Unity. So what I'm going to do is select this cube here, and if you have a camera and lamp in your scene, make sure those are deleted out. And then you're going to go to File, Export. I would recommend using FBX. And then what you can do is you can navigate to your Unity project, and I already have it here. And if you're using Blender, make sure this option is unticked, otherwise the scaling is going to be set to 100 by 100 by 100 instead of 1 by 1 by 1. And you can also export selected objects here in Blender if you'd like. And then just click Export. Now obviously the same process applies for really any other software. I'm just using Blender as an example here. And once that's exported, you'll see that it will appear here in Unity, and I can literally just drag that into my scene and use it. It's as simple as that. Likewise, if you have an asset that is not inside your Unity project, you can just import that asset from wherever it is on your computer. That's really all there is to importing and exporting assets, so if you're a 3D artist or want to create any work for Unity, I'd recommend doing that because it makes the process of game development a lot more fun, at least in my opinion. I'll see you in the next video. Welcome back everybody. This is going to be the final video before you're finally going to have the tools you need to create your very own scene inside of Unity. Now in order to do that, you're probably going to want some assets, so I'm going to introduce you to the Unity Asset Store. Now if you want to get to the Unity Asset Store, simply type that in Google and it should be the first link. Now just to be safe, you could just go to assetstore.unity3d.com as you can see here, and that should take you to the Asset Store. Likewise, you can also access the Asset Store within Unity itself. So once you go to the Asset Store, you should see a bunch of things here. There are some featured asset packs and other things like that, but you can choose what you want over here in these menus. So for example, if you wanted some 3D models, just click the drop down arrow for 3D models, and let's say you wanted some environments. There are dungeons, fantasies, all sorts of things here that you can search through. So let's say you wanted some dungeons, for example, for your game. Now a lot of stuff will pop up. As you can see, some of it costs money. You can pay money if you'd like, but you can also browse for some free ones. Simply drag this slider down to free, or you can just click free only, it doesn't really matter. And as you can see, all the free assets will be listed as well. And you can really do that for everything here. If you want industrial, it'll show all the free industrial things. And if you really want to buy some assets, you can of course do that. I just figure that free is what a lot of people want to get, especially if this is their first time using Unity. So go ahead and browse through the Unity asset store here, search for some assets, import them into Unity, and attempt to make your own scene. You should have all the tools you need to do that now. You know how to create your environment, paint textures, use your character, and all sorts of things like that. And if you already have experience in Unity, you could even try to write some scripts for your game to actually make the game functional. But you should have all the tools you need to at least create a scene, so go ahead and import some assets, and I really would like to see some of your scenes, guys, so if you do manage to create something cool, be sure to send me a message with it and I will check it out. I will see you in the final video of the course. Thanks. Congratulations, you have reached the end of the course. Although this course was short, you should now have all the necessary skills needed to create a level in the Unity game engine. Due to this course being short and concise, it should be noted that not every single aspect of Unity was covered. There are plenty of online resources to learn more about the engine, but with this course, you should have the ability to apply your new skills to all sorts of aspects within Unity. If you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to post in the discussions and I will try to help to the best of my ability. Take care and thanks for being my student.